Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce our closing keynote panel of the exchange, which will discuss the role of emerging technologies defending our nation. Please join me in welcoming General Joe Dunford, the 19th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Congressman Jack Auchincloss, United States Representative representing Massachusetts 4th District, and Dr. Nadia Shadlow, the 2nd Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy and a member of SCSP's Board of Advisors. They'll be in conversation with Dr. Megan O'Sullivan, Director of the Belfer Center at Harvard.
Good afternoon. We have spoken a lot today about endless frontiers and pushing the frontiers. And I would say there's been more optimism than pessimism in the room, which is fantastic. But in conclusion, we're now going to spend this last hour in this room together talking about geopolitics. And while I'm determined that we won't be downbeat, the realities are pretty sobering on the geopolitical front. Because everyone in this room is well aware, and I think our conversations have reflected it so far, we're in a different geopolitical environment than we were just a few years ago. We've departed from a 30-year period, which in retrospect was a relatively benign international environment, and one in which it was possible to pursue solutions to transnational problems with international cooperation. And the trend on the economic side was one towards increasing integration, which had some downsides, but a large number of benefits to the global population. And now we're in this different environment where the trends, I think, are arguably the opposite. And the new president will find him or herself with a very, very daunting national security and foreign policy making challenge inbox. We see great power competition as perhaps being the defining dynamic of the international system, but there are other new dynamics emerging, and we're in a process of trying to identify them, figure out how real they are, how lasting they'll be, and what they mean for our own capabilities and our own strategies. And of course, technology is going to play a role in all of this. So we have a fantastic group that's already been introduced, so I won't introduce them, but people who are well positioned to help us kind of navigate this particular geopolitical moment. And I'm going to ask them with just an opening question about how they see the landscape and what they think the first national security challenge that the new president will face is going to be, and how well we are equipped to confront that challenge. And so, General Dunford, I think I'll start with you because you're furthest away. What do you think the first national security challenge will be for the new administration? And again, how well are we positioned to tackle it?
Yeah, Megan, first thing that comes to mind is that as the story goes, when President Obama drove with President Trump on the first day of President Trump's first day in office, he said, the biggest challenge you're going to face is North Korea and their development of nuclear weapons. That problem is still out there, and arguably the context within which we're going to have to address that problem is probably more challenging. And then I also think Iran and the potential breakout in development of nuclear weapons in Iran. Of course, North Korea already has nuclear weapons, but a challenge. And so in addition to what's going on, which is why I don't mention that, we're already dealing with a war in Ukraine, we're already dealing with the Middle East, we're already dealing with Xi Jinping's 2027 and what that might mean and what that might not mean. I think the issue of nuclear weapons, the fact that there's no non-proliferation regime that's out there, an incident that's going to require the United States to address nuclear weapons with Iran and North Korea are two things that I think could very easily happen in the early days of a new administration. And how well we're able to deal with that, I think with regard to North Korea, we saw that we tried to put together a coalition over the last really 8 years and have been challenged to do that. And so I think we're gonna have difficulty.
Interesting. So you feel that the issues related to nuclear proliferation may be some of the first and most pressing issues?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, if I was to list the top issues in the inbox, the one I talk about is the fact that the relevance of nuclear weapons is an issue for the new administration, not only the rhetoric from Russia, but the fact that there is no arms control regime in place, and there's actually no non-proliferation regime in place. And I would have to put that close to the top of the inbox, and I use North Korea and Iran, and then the associated second-order effects of them possessing nuclear weapons in places like Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so forth. So I think the next administration, number one, has to think about what nuclear deterrence looks like in a very different strategic context, and then those specific challenges associated with Iran and North Korea that are involving nuclear weapons have to be addressed. And so, I'm specifically mentioning those, one, because of the strategic importance, but two, because they're beyond the current fight that we're dealing with, that everybody in this room is familiar with.
Great. Thank you very much. We are often talking about how these conflicts are becoming more interconnected, and here is a way in which there is a through line through some of them that maybe we hadn't focused on before. Dr. Shadlow, can I ask you the same question? And feel free to respond to anything that Joe said.
Sure. Well, I think basically the inbox of the next president will look very much like what we're seeing actually today. I don't think the war in the Middle East will be resolved. I don't think the war in Europe will be resolved. And I think he or she will have to address these ongoing wars while also being faced with the pressure of restoring deterrence at the same time. How do you restore deterrence in the midst of two wars? The outcomes of those wars will have a direct impact on our ability as a country to restore deterrence, which will be complicated and hard and goes to the heart of many of the issues that we spoke about today. All of the guests, I think a fundamental theme of today's event has been that in many ways. I think also relatedly is dealing with and navigating this, whether we call it an axis of aggressors or axis of losers, or I think The Economist actually had the best phrase, I always give it to the British, the quartet of chaos, and essentially having to deal with those four actors where they're intensifying. I mean, this is not new, but we're mixed in our ability to actually, we don't have really an operational plan for how to do that. Some have argued that we need to actually drive them closer together. Some make it more difficult for them to work together, but thinking about those issues, all against this backdrop of a fundamental need to restore deterrence. In 4 years from now, that to me is one of our strategic objectives as a country.
And when you say restore deterrence, and this is following on what Joe said, deterrence of who, what powers in particular, just a general deterrence, reestablishing deterrence for our allies, for the U.S. itself. Can you be more specific?
Yeah. I mean, primarily China. I mean, I think, most of us in this room probably agree that China is a pacing threat. General Dunford's worked on this issue for most of his career. So primarily China, but also other actors too. We need to basically focus on the ability to create capabilities so that we can wage sustained conflict if necessary. So there's the capacity problem of capabilities that we need, and the problem, and the issue of political will. It's not a new formula. It's one that everyone here studies at the Kennedy School at the Belfer Center. But I think primarily China.
Thank you. And Congressman.
And Iran. I mean, Iran too. I mean, basically, it's the axis of the quartet of chaos.
Fantastic. And Congressman, could I get your view on what the next administration is going to face out of the box?
I wish the quartet of chaos was going to be number one in the inbox of national security threats for the next administration. Regrettably, I think the answer is domestic, because one of two things is going to happen. One, Kamala Harris is going to win. Donald Trump is going to claim it was rigged, guaranteed. He'll claim it was rigged, and we're not going to have an orderly transfer of power for the second presidential cycle in a row. January 6, 2021 was Xi Jinping's best day in office, because when the United States degrades its democratic institutions on the world stage, we undermine our own ability to build the coalitions and the credibility that allow us to fight the quartet of chaos. That's one option. The other option is Donald Trump wins, and within the first 3 months, he's going to ask military officers to pledge fealty to him, either implicitly or explicitly. Again, he's been very clear about that. And that's going to be a national security crisis as well, for reasons that I think everybody in this room can intuit, that the 250-year tradition of swearing an oath to the Constitution is going to start to fray. And that is a real challenge in our military's morale and readiness. So I wish that in the next 3 months, China was our biggest problem, but unfortunately it's going to be the Beltway. And it's going to lend further credence to the wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, who said that all the armies of all the emperors of the world could not take a sip of the Mississippi. If we're going to die, it'll be by suicide.
Okay, I said I wasn't going to be downbeat, but you have beat me to it for sure.
Hey, Megan, just one
Yeah,
alibi.
I thought I'd get some responses to
ju-
that before
but
we move on.
One alibi, just a different way of talking about what the congressman's speaking about, because I do think that in the wake of the election, some consensus on national security is going to be what's required for us to deal with all the challenges that have been discussed today. So regardless of political persuasion and what domestic challenges we have to overcome, which others are more qualified to speak about than me, in order to, one, frame the problems properly, and then resource all of our agencies within the U.S. government, particularly the Department of Defense, properly, there's going to have to be consensus in the executive branch, the legislative branch, and frankly, across the country, that these are the challenges. We are willing to expend the resources necessary to properly address those challenges. This is what national interests are at stake and so forth. And I think that the clarity that we had during the Cold War, which everybody seems to long for right now, certainly doesn't exist today. And I think I probably want an alibi to go back, went down the nuclear path. That may be number two, and maybe number one is first, let's agree on what the problems are that we have to solve, and then number two, we'll get into the specific problems, which again, as I mentioned, in my view, this issue of nuclear weapons has to be considered at the top of the list.
I really want to underscore what the general just said there about agree on the problem to solve. I've seen this as a member of the Select Committee on China, where I think 80% of the value that committee has created, and I think it's been a valuable bipartisan committee, has been creating shared awareness and shared conviction around the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, because what we have not done a good enough job of, and I say we as like the broad just policymakers in Washington of both parties, is articulating to the American people what we are dealing with. We are dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, with junior partners in Russia and Iran and North Korea, and they seek to upend and overturn the rules-based international order that we've architected since World War II. And they believe that the West is in decline and decay, and they are driving to disrupt and beat us, and we have not made that case to the American public.
I think it's to an added element of complexity to the congressman's point. I think there's a disagreement, both in the United States but even abroad, about whether or not we are restoring an international order that existed in since the post-Cold War period and the Cold War period, or whether or not we're creating a new type of order. And that's really part of what we're arguing about. And there are differences of opinion. Are you accepting that globalization is fundamentally changing? Are you accepting that we are moving toward a more regionalized world? So I think there are differences about restoring an old order or creating something new. What elements of the old do we keep? What do we acknowledge will no longer be the same, even if we wish it were? And I think we are having some serious debates. Sometimes it gets politicized and sometimes it gets partisan, but at the core, these are important issues, and they're legitimate issues for discussion.
And what is the mechanism through which we can come to this consensus, or we can have these debates? It seems, it's almost self-evident that we need to be united in what we see as the challenge in order to address it. But, is it Congress? Is it outside? Is it the executive branch? Where are we going to have these national discussions?
Well, I'm biased, but I would say Congress to start with. And the reason I would say that is that I'll just give concrete examples. If you look at where I think we've had broadly successful foreign policy approaches over the last half century, Taiwan, to me, would be a good example of that. It's because Congress, early on with the Taiwan Relations Act in the 1970s, was very clear. There was more assertive and hawkish than the executive branch. Congress was very clear in a bipartisan fashion, this is how we're approaching Taiwan. And for 50 years, regardless of administration, even really through the Trump and Biden vicissitudes, we've mostly had ballast in the ship of state. But here's a counterexample where it hasn't worked, is Iran. We've let presidents run Iran strategy fully from the Oval Office. We had Bush, create a vacuum of power with the invasion of Iraq. We've had Obama do the JCPOA. We had Trump tear up the JCPOA. We've had Biden do sort of in the middle. And Congress has never really weighed in or had a strong point of view in a bipartisan way about how we approach Iran. Congress has to be I think, the center and the North Star for U.S. foreign policy, because it creates guardrails that the rest of the world can then key into. They know that no administration is going to go too far one direction or the other.
Joe, do you have an answer to this question of
Until the
what's the
congressman
mechanism?
spoke, I was going to answer your question by saying yes, as you started going off to, should it be the executive branch, should it be the legislative branch? But I also think the Congress would certainly assure what we need, which is a bipartisan consensus on what problems have to be solved, and one that would provide a degree of continuity that's going to be necessary. You know, the one thing that I would say is in the next president's inbox, there are no challenges that I can think of that are going to be solved in a 4-year period. So laying the foundation for a long-term approach to dealing with China, to dealing with Iran, to dealing with Russia, to dealing with North Korea is going to be critical, and that long-term approach certainly has to come from the Congress. Having said that, I think that the person most effective at being able to communicate to the American people on a routine basis has to be the President of the United States, to be able to talk about these challenges. And then other people can be empowered to echo that. I would just say, without going back in history, part of my frustration when I was in uniform was very often people in uniform were not only making the case for how we were dealing with a particular problem, but they were making the case for why we were dealing with a particular problem. And I think what I would say is the why has to come from our political leadership, even as the how comes from people that might be in uniform or in the State Department or in the Treasury Department and so forth. And I do think we should distinguish between who's communicating the what we're trying to do and then who can talk to the how. And folks like me could talk about the how in my previous life, and folks like the congressman and the president need to be talking about the why. And you can't let the people that are executing policy own the why are we doing it.
No, thank you for that. Let me move us to China. We've already kind of broached the topic, but I expected that to be one of your answers at least, or one of you to answer that to the first question. So, Congressman, I'll start with you on the Biden administration's policy towards China, or strategy. The administration took some time to put it in place, but now it's been, articulated with in a combination of ways. One of them around technology and the small yard high fence, trying to narrow the basket of technologies that we keep out of the hands of China to ones that have national security implications, but then to allow economic ties in other domains. And then also the idea that we will confront China where it's necessary, but we will also seek cooperation where it's possible. And so I'm sure that's a poor summary of the overall strategy that many people have worked so hard on for some years. But do you sense this is the right place for a U.S. strategy towards China, the most consequential bilateral relationship to be? Or do you think there needs to be any modification, particularly when it comes to technology?
So much to dig into with that question. I'll try to give a couple very specific responses. Overall, I give the president high marks for his strategy regarding China over the last 4 years, mostly because of what has happened with Japan and South Korea. The rapprochement between those two has been, I think, a surprise to Xi Jinping and has been a really impressive force multiplier for U.S. diplomatic and military credibility in the Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, the AUKUS agreement as well. We have tighter military relations with the Philippines than we've ever had. These things are not getting into the headlines of the New York Times on a daily basis, but it's meaningfully changing the calculus in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I would give a big miss on failing to do any kind of economic or investment engagement with the Indo-Pacific. We should have joined the TPP, and now the biggest regional trading bloc in the Indo-Pacific is run by China. And we're not at the table, so we're going to be on the menu. This is a miss of the last two administrations, unfortunately. I think, just to build off what General Dunford said, with respect, I would say there actually are two things regarding China that we could get done in the next 4 years. One is get them to stop exporting fentanyl to the United States. 97% of fentanyl precursors come from the Chinese. 24 or so Chinese manufacturers are producing the great majority of it. It's getting laundered through Mexican drug cartels or shipped directly through the United States, mostly over airmail, but also by ships. This is a solvable problem. this is a law enforcement problem in China. The CCP is facilitating and subsidizing these exports, and they're poisoning Americans. 100,000 Americans are dying every year. This needs to stop. The second thing is they're importing Iranian oil. Probably about 90% of Iranian exports of their energy is going towards China. China actually doesn't need that energy. China has a very diversified energy portfolio and can find it elsewhere. Again, they're doing it really just to aggravate and disrupt US operations. Those two things, I think, are W's that the next president could put on the board in 5 years, 4 years.
And I think just to add, the amount of fentanyl coming in being seized has doubled over the past 4 years, and it's happening at the border. And I think maybe one point I would add in terms of national security challenges will be the border. Again, that's sort of it's a highly politicized issue, but it's an important one.
Could I stay with you, Nadia, on China? So one of the things in an overall, I think, well-articulated strategy that the U.S. has towards China right now, one criticism I think is fair is we still don't know what the end game is with China. Where is the U.S. trying to go? Where is it trying to take this relationship? Is there such thing as a stable equilibrium? Could you describe to us, do you see that as a problem, or can you articulate where you think the U.S. is trying to take this relationship over time?
Well, I think we have limited agency over the future direction of China. So I flip it, and my assumption, and some share it and some don't, is that China's goal is to displace the U.S. To displace U.S. power in the world, and China has been challenging us for years and years and years. So I think SCSP, the Belfer Center, many other institutes are looking at what we can do as a country to improve, to strengthen our strengths and reduce our weaknesses. So how do we protect our industries so that we can produce what we want when we need it? How do we restore an element of economic sovereignty? How can we ensure that we retain advantages in critical technologies? Again, everyone in this room are more expert than I am on this. SCSP is working on this for years. How do we ensure that our liberty and security into the long term is ensured? And that requires, to General Dunford's point, there's a how, a subtext of how in all of those strategic objectives. And it's the how that we often disagree with, or that we're, discussing. Do you reduce outward capital flows into China? Do you limit them? And we're having these debates and discussions. There's not agreement on the how. There may be consensus in some areas and others. So I see it ultimately as how do we create positive alignments for ourselves and ensure that our liberty and security is maintained for well into the future.
Thank you. And General Dunford, let me ask you a slightly different question on China. We heard earlier today sort of a vision of warfare in which fighter pilots would be sitting at their kitchen tables drinking coffee while the fight was happening in the air. First of all, love your impressions about how far into the future we have to look before that's the case. But when we're thinking about a potential military confrontation between the U.S. and China, and given the rapid pace of technological change in warfare, how do we prepare for such a confrontation? What are the risks of assuming that that is going to be the nature of the confrontation? And if so, what do we have to jettison in order to prepare for that kind of warfare? And is that something that is feasible to do now, or maybe not feasible, wise to do now?
So on the first piece, I wasn't able to attend all the presentations, but I did pick up a little bit about the idea that maybe it'd be more machines than people. I would just tell you, I'm still, and I think for the foreseeable future, certainly 10 years from now, somebody said it was Rumsfeld that said this, but we're going to war with the force that we have for the next 10 years. We can talk later, and I'm happy to talk about specific ways that we can develop that force, adapt that force, optimize that force, but we're going to war with the force that we have. And if war is an extension of politics and it's a fundamentally human endeavor, I'm tripping over it's going to be all about machines and autonomous vehicles and so forth, and we can talk more about that. I don't know how that would have solved Gaza. I don't know how that would have solved Fallujah. I don't know how that would have solved Ramadi. And I don't know how it would solve a problem like Taiwan. So the idea that we'll be having machines that will wage war and the pilot will be back in the ready room drinking coffee is not the reality that certainly I've experienced in my career, and not one I can project at any time in the near future. That'd be the answer to the first piece. On the second piece, when I look back at what is the challenge we have today that's different than maybe a decade ago, is we had deterrence against any potential adversary when the United States had the ability to project power when and where necessary to advance our national interests, and the ability then to operate freely when we got there. In the past, sea, air, land, and now sea, air, land, space, and cyberspace. So when I think about deterrence in an Indo-Pacific context, what I think about is convincing the Chinese, number one, that we can get there, and number two, that when we get there, we can implement the operational concepts that are necessary to fight and win. And we can all debate what that means and what Taiwan would look like in the wake of a war, but at the end of the day, the military dimension, which is what I'm referring to, the military dimension of deterrence has to be there. And in my mind, from a U.S. perspective, that is the ability to project power and then operate when we get there. And so as we think about protecting our infrastructure in the region, as we think about overcoming the cost curve of ballistic missile defense, when we think about integrating capabilities and be able to have all forces be able to leverage cyberspace, space capabilities, sea, air, land, and integrate those capabilities to be able to see, decide, and act faster than the adversary. Those are all areas that would enhance our deterrence and make it less likely that we're going to have conflict. But I think we have to convince adversaries that if conflict occurs, we will win. And we have to have a theory of victory.
So let me stay with you for a bit and go to the question, if technology, you don't see the trajectory of warfare going quite in that direction, or certainly not in a foreseeable future, where is technology coming in and changing the nature of warfare? So.
So let me give a specific example so that we don't have to talk theoretically. Here's a good example of where the whole conversation you've had today comes together in the real world. So if you just took the Aegis radar system that's critical right now in the Red Sea, that was, if you looked at that a few years ago, you would have said that's a piece of hardware. And in open source, every 2 months, every 6 months, that software is updated for that piece of hardware. Leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning, we can now, over the air, update the Aegis radar system in real time, every day. So we can characterize the threat, pass data, and deal with that threat instantaneously. Where some months ago, as we proliferate unmanned systems and other phenomena that are being dealt with by an Aegis system, if there was a new threat, we might not be able to update all the systems and be able to deal with that threat for months. So there's a perfect example. And then if you think about ballistic missile defense and the cost curve of dealing with it, not only in a Red Sea context, but protecting Guam as an example, directed energy and leveraging directed energy so we actually can overcome the logistics challenge and the sustainability problem of ballistic missile defense, and frankly strike capability as well. So I think we should start not talking about the technologies and emerging and what that might do to war, but we should start looking at the real world operational problems that we're dealing with today, prioritize those problems, and then unleash folks like the ones in this room in industry to solve specific problems. I mean, the problem statement that I talked about in that first example was not, hey, how do we take better advantage of AI? It was, how do we characterize data faster and act faster when dealing with a threat in the Red Sea to freedom of navigation? Oh, okay, well, I think we can make sure that the algorithm updates real time everything that we see every day, and so that data is going back someplace in the United States and being sent out and processed in real time. Directed energy, again, solves the problem of the sustainability piece and frankly, the accuracy and the effectiveness of our current missile defense systems.
Great. So the idea is more, you see technology is augmenting.
Well, see, I think
augmenting our capacity, addressing shortcomings and shortfalls and problems that exist rather than replacing it or transforming it. And then I'll ask Nadia and Jake maybe if looking at Ukraine, what they see as the lessons from that and the technology piece of warfare in
So-
that theater.
very quickly to that point, Megan, the way I think about it is, we're trying to adapt and develop the force that we have, even as we try in the future to do things in a fundamentally different way or a disruptive way. And so, we should be, when we think about technology, we should be thinking about it in how do we do things that we're doing today better. Aegis is an example, directed energy to deal with the cost curve as well as the mass problem that we have in missile defense. And then even as we then think about doing things in a fundamentally different way with technology. But in this kind of force development, going into force design continuum, the more specific we are in identifying the problems that we're trying to solve today, the better able we are to leverage the technology as it exists today and actually adapt the force that we're going to live with. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, the force that we have today is largely the force we're going to have for the foreseeable future. So can we enhance its capabilities? Can we optimize its capabilities? Can we adapt? That's the question.
I think we're seeing four things in Ukraine. One, I wish I had thought of this. I didn't. One of my colleagues did. We're seeing Mad Max and Star Wars playing out on the battlefield at the same time. And I think General Dumford and I were speaking in the green room before about this, about old systems, new systems, adapting, working together. Second, we're seeing speed of adaptation, right? That's been critical. The Ukrainians have taught us a lot about that. Third, we're seeing the importance of bringing in the operators, and it's linked to speed of adaptation, but the ability to adapt operationally too, bringing in the operators. And fourth, we're seeing the ability to build very quickly an industrial capacity that really didn't exist before. And I think that that's remarkable, and that's a story that will still be told. And all of those areas are important for us to really understand how we can take some of that and actually learn some lessons ourselves.
Great. Nadia, I want to take this conversation in the direction of a piece that you recently wrote in Foreign Affairs talking about defense strategy and the need for us to have something that you call an overmatch. And could you explain to this group what you mean by an overmatch capacity and what are the fundamental innovations or capabilities that we'll need to create that kind of strategy in the U.S.?
Well, I think the idea, it's a military concept, as many of you in the room will know, and certainly as General Dumford knows, he's seen it at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. But it's a very simple concept of you don't want to have a fair fight, right? You want to win in a particular situation. So it's not, and I tried to apply it actually across domains. I was asked the question, what should we be doing differently about great power competition? And I think somehow the competition side has almost led us to a certain stasis of some sort. Almost like I was trying to think of an analogy, one of those pools that you just swim in that are just sort of, we're staying afloat, we're doing our laps in one of those pools, but we're not really maybe getting to where we need to be. So what if and I posed this to the audience more, what's the difference between a competitive strategy and an overmatch strategy? I don't really know the answer to that question, but I do think it's an interesting one to pose. And so in the military domain, it's not force on force necessarily. It's using our competitive advantages. It's using asymmetries. It's being creative in all the ways that we've spoken about and we've discussed all day today. But what does it look like in the diplomatic realm? What does it look like in the development realm? I have ideas about that but that's just me ranting and raving. What does it look like, in the economic realm? I think we have some concepts actually in the economic realm, and they're being hotly debated today. Do you use tariffs to create certain advantages for your own industries or not? Some people would say yes, and that would be part of an overmatch strategy to get ahead, maybe to weaken our adversaries. So I offered some suggestions in the article. I don't think it's a case closed. I think there are all different ways to look at it. But I think fundamentally, is competition enough? Do we need to go further? Knowing we have limited resources, knowing we maybe can't even really ever get there, but if we try, will we be in a better place than we are today?
Can I build off that for a second? Because I love that paradigm. I think you framed that really nicely. And the things that came to mind when I was hearing you describe that were two things. One was energy and one was information. And to me, an energy overmatch looks like our ability to build 1,000 nuclear power plants in the next decade. Because if you look at the production curve that we have to be on to have enough energy to satiate our consumers, but also to compute all the AI that we want to do to power the technology of the future, like we're hitting exponential. And China's getting pretty good at building fission. They're also doing R&D on fusion that's at pace with our R&D. And I think the winner of that race, fission and fusion, is really, really important, because what they're going to start doing is once you get up that production cost curve and you get really good at building modular fission, you start to export it. You export it to Africa, for example, and you hook it up to their desalination plants and their electrical grids. And now you got the choke point on an entire society. We need energy overmatch. And it's got to be clean energy overmatch, and the math just doesn't work for any other type of energy other than fission or fusion. I love offshore wind, I love geothermal, it's great. I got some of it in my district. It's atoms. But then the other one is information, and I think here, to be candid, I feel like we've been overmatched on the information front. With TikTok, we allowed a company that answers to the Chinese Communist Party. Let's be very clear, TikTok answers to the Chinese Communist Party. We allowed it to become the dominant platform for information and entertainment for 170 million Americans, including the majority of people under 30. The majority of people under 30 say the first place they go for news or entertainment is TikTok. So we are allowing the next generation of American policymakers and American electorate to be inculcated in an ideology whose algorithm is controlled by our biggest adversary. It's like if Walter Cronkite were a Soviet spy at the height of the Cold War. And we led a bill to force the divestment of TikTok out of the Select Committee on China, and they howled about free speech, and I've defended free speech for the last decade. The First Amendment is alive and well. You can say whatever you want about me. That's totally fair game. There's no civil liberties for an algorithm in Beijing. And I think we've got to sever that connection. But then two, let's start to think creatively about how we puncture the Great Firewall. Because there's 1.4 billion people who are living in an information ecosystem that's telling them that things are going great in China. They're not, actually. They're facing real demographic and economic challenges. And the thing that scares Xi Jinping the most is his own people, like is true with any dictator.
I completely agree with the Congressman's points. And on the, I'll just give SCSP a plug, but they have created a fusion commission to actually look at these key challenges and to ensure that we retain our competitive edge.
So if we think about the build-out of nuclear power, as you described it, it's going to require some fundamental changes in policy. Permitting reform is something that has consistently been on the list of things that policymakers need to do, that Congress needs to do. But if we're going to enable these big tech companies to meet their energy needs without it coming at the expense of other consumers, we're going to have to change the way that we do things within our own society. Do you think that Congress is up for that?
Yes, and in fact, we did it. So this year, we passed the Advance Act. The Advance Act streamlined and I would say rationalized regulation for fission and also created a regulatory architecture for fusion that recognizes that fusion is not fission, right? Which sounds obvious, but it was important for the federal government to understand that and the regulators to promote that. So we actually have now a pretty good regulatory apparatus. I think there's two things we need. One is we need the political will. We need the next president of the United States to stand up and say we're going to build 1,000 nuclear power plants. And by the way, they should also say we're going to build 10 million units of housing. We're going to build more ships in the Chinese Navy. We need to be builders again. Let's build. And the president can say that and galvanize people. And then the other thing we need to do is the Department of Energy has to do milestone-based public-private partnership with the private sector, like they did with SpaceX quite effectively. We bootstrapped SpaceX cooperatively. And the same thing can happen with fusion, with milestone-based payments. But that element of it is not as well established as the regulation yet.
Right. I think there's still some real work to be done on the permitting if we're going to get this kind of energy going forward. Let me come back to this quartet of chaos or adversarial alignment, or call it whatever you would like. So this is a concept that we at the Belfer Center have been talking about a lot, as well as many others. And there's some skepticism among my colleagues about how real this entity is or how real this cooperation is. Could I ask you, Nadia, maybe to say a little bit about it, and then General Dunford, ask you, for your thoughts on whether you think this is a kind of alignment that will change the way the U.S. has to think about its own capabilities. So first, Dr. Shadlow, what kind of evidence do we see of this alignment, and do we think it's going to be an enduring one?
I'm not sure if alignment is the right word, but something is happening. Maybe it's like Swiss cheese, right? I mean, so there are lots of holes in the alignment, but there's something holding it together. So I agree with the argument that this is not a formal alliance, nor is it necessarily a political alignment of countries who have similar ideas. But we're seeing 6,000 North Korean troops in the middle of Europe, right? That's different. And I can go through all the facts, but you all know them. The cooperation between Iran and Russia on developing their militaries, the ammunition that North Korea has already provided. They are together presenting us with multiple challenges. And that's also always the essence of strategy, is how do we respond to multiple challenges coming in at different levels by different actors. Now, I don't know if they're all coordinating. I don't think they're sitting together in a situation room somewhere saying, let's present the United States with multiple challenges. But nonetheless, in a bilateral way, and actually they work much more effectively bilaterally, right? They're doing this bilaterally. They're not working through a large multinational process to get them to figure out how to make our life more difficult. Putin's calling up North Korea and saying, hey, can you send your guys over, right? They're not working through processes. We tend to be process-oriented in how we work. So I think it would be hard to deny that something is going on. Will it be enduring? Well, I mean, it's been fairly effective so far. So if I were them, I would say, hey, let's continue to present these challenges to the United States, because at the very least, our power is being diminished and challenged.
Megan, I think it'd be a mistake for us to use our understanding of alliances, evaluate, this axis, and say they fall short of the mark, or take comfort from the fact that maybe on the surface it's transactional and it doesn't have the same depth. But let's, in addition to the troops in North Korea, microelectronics going from China to Russia, ammunition going from North Korea to Russia, unmanned vehicles going from Iran to Russia. And so intelligence sharing, technology transfer, these kind of things are taking place. And they're acting, whether or not there's a central decision-making body that brings them together, they're acting in a way that is creating for us real strategic challenges. Their cooperation is impacting our ability to deal with the challenges in Ukraine. The cooperation that's ongoing, between Iran, non-state actors, and frankly China, is keeping Iran from being isolated and creating challenges in the Middle East. And so, in my view, there is sufficient cooperation, collaboration, and indeed, I would even use the word alignment in many ways to say that we are dealing now with a global problem, not a regional problem. And that's really the so what of all of this. And I think I actually align myself with the National Defense Strategy Commission that actually talks to the inadequacy of the current strategy in dealing with simultaneity. And simultaneity created by this axis and the support that they provide each other. And also, as you think about our capabilities and capacities and the capabilities and capacities of our allies and partners, because of this alignment axis, call it what you will, we're required to be present and to be prepared to act in each of those theaters that I just spoke about. And collectively, with our allies and partners, and certainly the defense industrial base issues have been highlighted sufficiently over the last couple of months, we can all understand that. We are incapable right now, from a capability and capacity perspective, to deal with these three simultaneous challenges that exist right now with actors who cooperate, collaborate, and support each other. So I think it's a very real strategic problem. And the last point I'd make is the 2017 National Defense Strategy, we said in that strategy that the single most important thing we needed to do was to prevent an alignment between Russia and China. This was in 2017. And it's 2024, and arguably that has moved in a direction completely inconsistent with where we thought it should. And to that has been added North Korea and Russia. And as I always say, President Bush was only wrong about one thing when he said the axis of evil. He was probably off a bit in his timing, because what he said is, in fact, in my view, in existence today.
And Nadia, you actually were one of the key authors in the 2017 National Security Strategy that identified Russia and China as two countries with which we needed to have intense competition rather than taking a more cooperative approach. Do you think we missed the significance of the growing relationship between the two of them? Do you wish we had focused on that earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think that strategy, I'd flip it slightly, and the argument was that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are actively competing with us and are actively seeking to reduce American power, and in China's case, maybe displace American power. I mean, I know I'm sitting here facing Dr. Allison, so aware of the arguments about this. And given that, how do we have to think more competitively. Our mindset needs to shift, not just our Defense Department, but the other departments and other parts of our government. But yes, I think a significant change from that period in 2017 to today, I agree with General Dumpert, was that these countries would be working together in a more concerted way to present, as I said, operational and strategic challenges to us.
Just on that point, do we see them cooperating primarily or exclusively bilaterally, or do we see any more multilateral among the four?
No, they're getting, yeah, I
Is
mean,
it all
obviously they're
bilateral?
using international institutions in the UN and the Security Council in different ways. But I think an advantage they have is that they're often willing to work bilaterally to get something done quickly on the ground. So I think they're working diplomatic channels, of course, to reduce, to isolate us in international multilateral forum.
Megan, I also think one of the most significant things is how it's kind of redefined the strategic challenges of planning. There was a time, not too long ago, where we could say there could be regional conflict and we needed to deal with opportunism that might arise in one or two other regions. And so we had very much 1990s through really just a few years ago an assumption that there would be regional conflict. So I think we should think about the implications of these four actors and whether they cooperate in a hub and spoke method or there's a lattice approach to it, whatever it happens to be. The fact of the matter is that their cooperation, alignment, again, call it what you will, has significantly complicated our strategic planning where there is no such thing as a regional conflict. We are today dealing with a global conflict. And any future war is going to have global implications, and we have to think about it. I mean, if you look at Israel in a microcosm and you think about how they're dealing today with Gaza, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Iran, they've got multiple threats surrounding them. At a broad strategic level, that's where we would be, were we to be involved in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific or the Middle East and Europe. We would be dealing with very significant and real threats that would have to be addressed simultaneously elsewhere. There wouldn't be a deal with opportunism. We would be dealing with a very real challenge, and we would be dealing with folks that would be cooperating back and forth in dealing with these issues.
So how well are we structured to respond to that reality if we're now not going to face regional conflicts, but are consistently going to be faced with global conflicts? The Pentagon, an institution you know extremely well, how well situated is it to deal with that kind of consistent threat?
So number one, there's the capacity issue, and I think we can all agree we don't have the capacity to deal with all of those challenges, and the defense industrial base is inadequate, so let's put that aside. And we're really talking about capabilities, capacities, and we're talking about planning and process. With regard to planning, although we've made some incremental changes to the way we plan, we still plan for specific problems and not necessarily in a global context. And I think can be no such thing as regional plans anymore. They have to be global plans, and we have to assume that there will be things we have to be dealing with in a very real way globally in any conflict at all. So when you think about the prioritization and allocation of resources, when you think about what I describe as strategic fires, right? Cyber capabilities, space capabilities, capabilities don't belong to any specific geographic combatant commander. Those are all areas where we have insufficient resources to deal with a global threat. And to be honest with you, in the National Defense Commission introduces something that I think we ought to pursue and think very seriously is we have a unified command plan of our geographic combatant commanders that is very much oriented on a regional way. And if what I just said is true, right, if that's an assumption that we make about any conflict we have being global in nature, then frankly, we got to rethink about how we're organized within the department to be able to deal with global conflict.
Yeah, fair point. I'm going to ask the Congressman one last question, and then I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to say anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to say in closing. So Congressman, we've talked a lot today just in general about the Pentagon and how it is not that well suited to adopting innovation. You know, that there's incredible innovation happening in the military space, but adoption is slow. But if we look at our other institutions, how well suited are they to the challenges ahead, and particularly Congress? Like, is Congress well suited to this strategic landscape? And if not, what might change with Congress to make it more so?
The best thing that could happen to Congress would be to change the format of our elections at the state level. Right now, out of 435 seats in Congress, only about 35 every 2 years are actually competitive, which means that for 400 members of Congress, they're looking at their flanks, your Republican base or your Democratic base, and you have to win your primary election, and then you're guaranteed to win your general election, which creates the incentive. It's a centrifugal incentive structure. Everyone's talking to their flanks, and it makes it a very polarized body. That's exacerbated by partisan gerrymandering. That's all fixable, and in fact, it has been fixed in the past. None of this is a new problem for America. At the state level, we can do preliminary top two voting. At the federal level, we can end partisan gerrymandering and adopt style closer to what New Jersey does, for example, which works very effectively. But the basic idea is you want every member of Congress competing for that voter at the 50-yard line of their district. That is what the incentive structure is that you want. Because I'll tell you, I know most of these members of Congress. Most members of Congress are good people. They're normal, good, reasonable people. You can go out to dinner with them. They have good ideas. They're nice people. But humans are their incentives over the long term. And if you don't change the incentive structure for Congress, you're going to get what we get. And we got to fix that. And that will allow us to be more serious in our strategic planning.
Great. We just have 3 minutes left, so I'd like just to give you each 1 minute to close, say anything that's on your mind that we haven't had an opportunity to touch on. I'll begin with you, General Dunford.
Yeah, so maybe, consistent with the theme today, and Secretary Carter, when I think back to his legacy on DIU and really more broadly trying to figure out how to better leverage commercial technology and bring it into the department and accelerate the path of capability development, which he was very focused on and had a big impact. I think we have made some progress over the last few years. I think what remains to be done, though, is the department right now, from my perspective, I'm in the category of I wish I knew then what I know now, a few years out and looking back. And the focus of technologies, we need to reorient a bit and start talking about capabilities. And back to something I mentioned a couple of times earlier in the panel, the specific identification of problems to be solved. I mean, in terms of things like that Aegis example I gave, or integrating legacy systems, not trying to solve joint all-domain command and control, but trying to make airplanes talk to ships or satellites talk to unmanned systems and those kind of things. And I think the more dialogue that takes place between the people who actually understand technology and the people who have real operational problems, the faster then we can accelerate the path of capability development. Where we are now is we articulate our problems in the form of requirements and specific programs that we initiate, as opposed to real-term dialogue with operational commanders, so that folks who are actually in the space understand the operational problems to be solved and begin to link their capabilities to solve those problems. And there are, I think, by the way, that all is not lost. There are some very specific examples. I can point to Indo-PACOM for those familiar with the Joint Fires Network or the defense of Guam that Aegis example I mentioned. I mean, there's a lot of positive examples where that kind of dialogue has resulted in change. But we have to operate, I would argue that the Aegis example is operating at the speed of war, but that's the exception. In most cases, with regard to requirements and the dialogue that we have with industry in the plans that we have to leverage commercial technology is much more of a normal process of procurement and acquisition, which is not fast enough.
I guess my plea to the next administration would be to focus on implementation. It's critical. We don't need more executive orders. We have them in both both Trump administration, Biden administration, executive orders on AI, executive orders on vulnerability to critical minerals, which we've had for 40 years in executive orders, literally. So I would just say we need to focus on obstacles. It's boring, it's difficult. Once we identify those obstacles, we can then give them to constructive congressmen like the gentleman here, where you can get Congress to work together to start to remove those obstacles. But as I've said before in other fora, time is critical here. It's an underappreciated dimension of strategy, and these obstacles are preventing us from getting to where we need to be, which then in the end does undermine confidence in America as a democracy, because we can't get things done anymore.
We need to win in Ukraine, not lose. We need to win in Ukraine. That means a secure eastern border. That means freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. That means a defense industrial base that can defend the country. That means accession to the European Union. There needs to be a big, searing W on that war. To me, that is where we have agency. That's where the next president can authorize Ukraine to strike inside of Russian territory, particularly at their oil refining capacity, that would hobble their industrial complex, that would allow Ukraine to build out the kind of technology and capabilities that it needs to be self-sufficient in the long run. But we have to win in Ukraine. There needs to be strategic clarity and conviction about it that rallies not just NATO, but our East Asian allies as well.
Great. I want to thank you all for a great conversation. Please join me in thanking our panel.